Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar Wednesday. Today's webinar is the development that enhances wildlife, biodiversity net gain and making biodiversity work for you. So I'm your moderator today, I'm Jack, I'm the PR and Digital Comms Coordinator at CABE. And there's lots of different ways that you can interact today. You can send in questions through the GoToWebinar panel, or you can catch up later on YouTube and you can tweet about it with hashtag CABECPD. Today's presenter is Tom Butterworth, the Technical Director at WSP. Tom has worked with people and businesses across a large number of high-profile projects in the UK and overseas. Tom has over 20 years experience working as an environmental expert. Over this time, Tom has developed and delivered local, regional and national biodiversity strategies and action plans, including leading programs of research and managing the delivery of UK government's biodiversity strategy. So I'm going to pass you over to Tom now and enjoy the webinar.
Thank you very much, Jack. Just before I go ahead, can you see my slides and can you hear me all okay?
I'm just going to pass them over there, Tom. Okay, there you go.
Okay, that should be showing my screen now, yes? Good, okay, so thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for joining this morning. As Jack's already said, my name is Tom Butterworth. I work for WSP. I lead our work there on Biodiversity Net Gain. And if you don't know what Biodiversity Net Gain is, hopefully by the end of this webinar you will. We have WSP is quite a large consultancy, about 8,000, 9,000 people in the UK. 140 or so are ecologists, and I have a bespoke team working on Biodiversity Net Gain within that. But I won't say any more about that now. What I want to get into is what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to briefly just make sure that we all understand what biodiversity is, make sure that we're all on the same page, touch on the existing policy and legislation, and I'm not going to do much more than touch on it, but just to flag that it's there and some of the things that it covers. Then we're going to talk about the 25-year plan for the environment. This is a plan that's England focused, but got some really interesting pieces in there, particularly one of those being environmental net gain. Then we're going to get into biodiversity net gain, which is one part of environmental net gain. And we're going to give an overview of the process that you go through when taking a biodiversity net gain approach to a development, give an overview of the assessment that you would have to do, and then talk about the lessons learned. It's quite a lot to get through, so it will be an overview of these things, and I'll be pointing you to other information if you need it. So, without further ado, biodiversity. The variety of life is one way of talking about biodiversity. It's the diversity of species and all their interconnections between one another and the ecosystem they live within. I saw a piece on the BBC website recently saying biodiversity is a sciencey word for nature and all its connections. Sciencey is obviously a journalist word for things that perhaps just need a little bit of explaining. So it's becoming increasingly used as a term, and it's an important term because it describes not just the species and their diversity, but how they interrelate as well, the ecosystems which they are part of. And in the UK, we have a lot of protection for our biodiversity already in place. This is a list that's England focused. I'll mention some of the pieces from Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales later. But you can see here we've got a long list of environmental law and policy ranging from Wildlife and Countryside Act, the Natural Environment Rural Communities Act, national planning policy. There's going to be a few that I pull out here, particularly the national planning policy, a green future, our 25-year plan for the environment, and the environment bill. The environment bill, you'll see, says 2019 ? That's not been published yet. That's something that is on the books for coming up over the next few months. So all of this policy, what does it actually mean? Well, the real focus of this is to protect a whole range of species and key habitats. And this is much more Scotland focused images here, but Scotland has some fantastic wildlife, so why not? You'll probably be well aware that our policy and legislation protects important species like the great crested newt, bats, otters, there's also a golden eagle on that slide, and so on. And we have to put in place some really quite important and significant sometimes protections for those species. On top of that, we've got protected sites, the SSSIs, or sites of special scientific interest, and our complementary and generally overlapping Natura 2000 sites, or the sites that are identified as a result of our the habitat regulation coming through from European directives. Those sites and our protected species really are the focus for our work to enhance biodiversity. And those sites in England cover about 8% of the land, which might seem like a reasonable proportion to give over to wildlife, when that's largely focused in upland areas, and so it actually ends up being quite a small proportion of most parts of England. Scotland has slightly larger areas of protected area, but again, it's a similar proportion. Why is this important? Well, the biodiversity outside these areas is actually really valuable as well, whether you're in the wider farmed environment or in the city itself. And this is evident from some of the information that we've started to gather over the last 30, 40 years on the state of our biodiversity. And for those of you who have been reading the news recently and seen the IUCN's report, that's the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. There's international reports coming out at the moment stating that we're losing our biodiversity. So this is no new news, but it is important nevertheless. This graph is taken from the DEFRA's statistics on biodiversity. We're losing about 1% a year, 0.8% a year in abundance and distribution, roughly. That means that in my lifespan, we've lost about a third of our biodiversity, which is really significant because at some point, there'll be tipping points. There'll be points where our biodiversity collapses and the ecosystems are no longer supported. We don't know when those tipping points will come, but as we increase the loss, as it were, then we're going to get closer to those tipping points. So what are the government doing about this? Well, last year, certainly in England, they produced a 25-year plan for the environment. And this states a whole load of bits and pieces. So it talks about trying to achieve clean air, plentiful water, thriving plants and wildlife, reducing risk from environmental hazards such as flooding and drought, and so on and so on. And many of you may well be saying, well, this is nothing new, is it? Surely these plans always state these types of things, and that's absolutely right. And if we go further into this, I'm not expecting you to be able to read the stuff on the right, but it's not an infographic, is it? It's just a graphic with some information in it, which is not quite the same thing. But they've got it setting out their goals and their policies that they'll focus on. And these focus on using and managing land sustainably, enhancing nature, the same old stuff we've seen in plans and policies for the last 20 years at the very least. So what's different about this? Well, one of the key things that is different about this is that there's a clear set of statements saying we will, meaning the government will take forward certain actions. And at the very top of these, in Chapter 1, we've got using and managing land more sustainably. And it says we will embed an environmental net gain principle for development, including housing and infrastructure. Now, you may have come onto this call thinking this is about biodiversity net gain. Why is he talking about environmental net gain? Well, I assure you, many of us reading this report when it came out last January said exactly the same thing. We understood what biodiversity net gain is, and we'll go into that in more detail in a moment. We understood some of the benefits that you're getting from nature, and we might want to talk about the gains from those. But environmental net gain was a new term to all of us, so it was a bit of a surprise. I think it may have been a new term to a few of the people drafting the report, but that's just my speculation. And to start with, I thought that this was just a way of trying to simplify that terminology of biodiversity, to simplify the idea of what nature is into a term that we might all understand. But actually, there's a more nuanced picture behind this, or at least that's what's developing now, which is really quite valuable. So to talk about that, I just want to take a step back briefly and talk about how biodiversity fits into a larger picture. This is a graphic from the Natural Capital Coalition's website. And you can see there on the bottom left, biodiversity. Biodiversity underpinning our natural stocks. So by natural stocks, we mean minerals, the water, the air we breathe, but also things like our forests and our wildlife, our fish stocks, our farmed environment, the whole piece of the environment that provides us with a whole base of natural capital, alongside things like our manufactured capital and so on. This natural capital provides a whole load of flows, and that might be, and these flows might be things like changing our air quality, cleaning our water, pollination services, and so on. These services then provide a whole lot of benefits to us. And just as we're really degrading our ecosystems, we're really starting to understand the benefits that we're getting from the environment, whether that be in terms of improving air quality, decreasing flood risk, improving water quality, providing our food and pollination, or more directly, perhaps, improving our health and well-being. So how does this sit with this term of environmental net gain? Well, and this is a slide from, it's the only slide that's got Lego pictures on it. It's the only slide from Natural England and DEFRA. So thank you very much to Natural England and DEFRA for letting me use this. But we've got a starting block of biodiversity net gain, and we'll talk more about what that is in a minute, but I'm just trying to give you some context about where this is heading. So biodiversity net gain is about the impacts on habitats and wildlife. And trying to deliver gains for those areas of biodiversity. On top of that, Natural England, DEFRA are talking about stacking these natural capital gains, the benefits that we're getting from the ecosystem services. And then on top of that, we're talking about environmental net gain, about decreasing indirect pressures from onto the environment. So that might be decreasing pollution, it might be managing waste, and so on. This is an interesting way of thinking about sustainable development, starting from the ecosystem up, and starting to think about how our biodiversity and our natural capital and so on can support that sustainable development picture. So that's where biodiversity net gain is sitting within this wider context. And we've started to talk about why bother deliver biodiversity net gain. But first of all, we need to understand what biodiversity net gain is. So very simply, it's a target for development projects in which losses are balanced and outweighed by measures taken to avoid, minimize, and compensate for those impacts. So in other words, it's a target that leaves biodiversity in a better state at the end of the development than at the beginning. So if we go back to our previous slide, we can see that biodiversity net gain, leaving biodiversity in a better state, then building on that, an idea of creating gains for natural capital that will provide all of those wider benefits that we're receiving. And then building on that, an idea of decreasing pressures to further improve those gains. Now, where we are in the process of this is we've got a really good method and understanding for how to do biodiversity net gain. We're starting to develop ideas on natural capital ecosystem services and how those relate to the biodiversity net gain agenda. So there's a progress both in terms of how you stack these things together up this staircase, but also in terms of where we are in the development of this work. And biodiversity net gain has been being used and developed for a while now. It's underpinned by a set of good practice principles. These have been published by CIEM, Syria, and IEMA. That's the Chartered Institute for Ecologists and Environmental Managers, Construction Industry Research and Information Association, and the Institute for Environmental Management and Assessment. I always have to read those. These 10 principles are not just plucked out of the air. They're based on international principles that are have been developed by Business and Biodiversity Offsetting Program, BBOP, and some of these principles have been taken and underpin the work that is set out by the World Bank and International Finance Corporation. So they're not just plucked out of the air. And when taking forward and delivering these gains for biodiversity through a development project, we need to take account of each of these principles. I'm not going to go into these in detail. These organizations have produced an extensive piece of guidance on this that's available free from their websites. It goes through these principles and some of the steps in development that I'm going to talk about today in terms of biodiversity net gain. So you can go there and start to really understand what each of these pieces mean. I'm going to pull out a few of these though, and one of them is this first one, the mitigation hierarchy. So that's at the top of our 10 guiding principles, and this really has already been described in the definition of biodiversity net gain. That's to avoid, minimize, and compensate for the impacts that you're looking to have on biodiversity. So this slightly overcomplicated looking graph is actually quite simple. The yellow section at the left is the potential impact on the development. We then take steps to avoid those impacts. That's the white bar at the bottom. We then might mitigate, that's the light green. We might then try to restore on site, and that's the blue. And then if you're still not getting a gain for biodiversity, then you might deliver compensation elsewhere. Now, most developments, well, let me reframe that. An awful lot of developments that we work on deliver gain on site. So they're able to get to that blue bar, and actually that takes them on to gain on site. It depends heavily on the development itself, but that's very often the case. So there's often no need for those offsets, but this is something that a lot of organizations have been picking up, and we'll come back to that and why in a moment. So that's the mitigation hierarchy. That underpins what we're doing. And biodiversity net gain is not a way of sidestepping that and jumping to offsetting. It's a way of standardizing that process and following through that in a robust and straightforward manner. So why bother? Well, we've already talked about this to a degree. We already know that we're losing our biodiversity. We need to reverse that trend. We need to reverse it because we don't want to leave biodiversity in an appalling state. We don't want to leave our grandchildren with nothing but rats and cockroaches to play with in the garden. We've also started to talk about the ecosystems and the benefits that they provide, and this is a different way of presenting the same thing, but we're providing a whole load of benefits from nutrition, clean air, water, health, enjoyment, that provides a whole range of values, and of course that then has knock-on impacts to the environment. So I quite like this because it shows that circular relationship. But there's other reasons for taking forward biodiversity net gain. And as I said, a lot of organizations have been picking this up already. People like Network Rail, Highways England, Berkeley Group, Scottish and Southern Energy, Transport for London, and many others, lots of local authorities as well. And they've been picking this up not only because it's good for wildlife, it provides wider benefits, but for a whole range of other reasons as well. Assessing biodiversity in this way can improve site selection. It means we know what we're stepping into in terms of developing the site. It can help secure consents. It can make sure that we are avoiding last-minute objections, really important, and potentially saving money. It supports relationship building. I've been in meetings where potentially quite tricky stakeholders have gone away saying, this is really great, we love what you're doing, we're very supportive of the scheme. And when a wildlife conservation group says we're supportive of development, we know that we're doing something right. It can help deliver other commitments and requirements. And this comes back to this point about natural capital. It's mentioned specifically excuse me, is mentioned specifically in the principles about optimizing sustainability. Deliver biodiversity net gain, but then enhance and deliver other requirements as well. That might be recreational space. It might be decreasing flood risk. How can your areas that are decreasing flood risk also support biodiversity? It demonstrates leadership. I've already mentioned a whole load of organizations, so it's already boosting their reputation. It increases financial value of the site. Decreasing business risk is another piece I just wanted to pull out briefly. This is really valuable if we're creating some mitigation areas for species on the verge of a highway, for example. It would be much more sensible to create that in another area, slightly off-site perhaps, because when we come to manage those sites, or in a few years' time, if we want to put another sign on the verge, and that happens to be in our areas of mitigation, we're going to have to move that mitigation again. That's costly, but also it's not great for the ecology. So it's decreasing business risk. It's also decreasing the risk to the ecology. Oh, and the final reason, perhaps, and perhaps the reason we'd go to first very often, but the final reason I've got here is that this is increasingly within planning policy. Within England, we've got a really strong policy in the National Planning Policy Framework that states that developments should deliver biodiversity net gain. In Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, the policy isn't as strong or isn't as directive, but it is really clear in each of these cases that we should be looking to follow the mitigation hierarchy. As it says in Wales, prevent losses, compensate for losses where damage is unavoidable. We should follow that mitigation hierarchy, but also we should try and enhance biodiversity where possible. And if that wasn't enough, to add the icing to the cake, the Chancellor's spring statement, in the Chancellor's spring statement, he said, to ensure wildlife isn't compromised, we're going to mandate biodiversity net gains on new developments in England. Now, my understanding of that is that that will focus on the Town and Country Planning Act, that it'll come through within the Environment Bill, which is why I had that Environment Bill 2019 question mark listed in my slide earlier. And the government's position on this is that within England, biodiversity net gain is already something that development should be delivering. And this mandatory requirement is just to standardize that, is just to make sure that some local authorities and areas aren't trying to deliver huge amounts of biodiversity while others delivering none, and actually to get a level playing field for this work. So this is really welcomed. And along with this comes a standard way of assessing biodiversity, which I'm going to touch on in a moment. So the next points I want to cover, so that's context. We've talked a little bit about policy context. We've talked a little bit about why we should be doing this. And I've described briefly the overview of what biodiversity net gain is with those 10 principles. What I want to come on and give an overview on is the process, and some barriers and solutions, lessons learned. And then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. So this is the process that's set out within the guidance that I told you about earlier, the guidance that's been produced by CIEM, Syria and IEMA. This is a process that's meant to mirror, but not be exactly the same, mirror a development process. Or follow a development process. It's not exactly the same because we've got a monitoring and maintenance piece at the end that's often longer within the biodiversity net gain work than many developments work with at the moment. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to step through each of these stages. The key message here, if you want to switch off while I go through this, I hope you don't, but if you do, the key message is that biodiversity net gain plays a part in each of these. And there's a role to pick up and run with for each of these stages. So in feasibility and scoping, and by this, for say a road scheme, we might mean optioneering, we might be looking at master planning. But what's really key here is that we understand our goal. And this may well be set nationally within the Environment Bill. We may have a really clear message that a 5% or 10% net gain is what you're aiming to deliver using a specified metric developed by DEFRA. We need to apply the mitigation hierarchy, engage stakeholders. But what's really important here is we can use this assessment to start to understand, even at this feasibility stage, we can start to understand the potential impact that different options might have. And this is really valuable because it allows us to make that choice between those options with another piece of information in our back pocket, a piece of information saying, well, what's the likely compensation that's going to be needed from each of these different options? That can be reinforced in the impact assessment. When we start to actually survey information on the ground, we can update our baseline assessment and we can further apply this mitigation hierarchy. When we run through into design, we start to understand what the scheme is going to look like. And from there, we can start to assess both the baseline and the post-development scheme. So we can look at the habitats there at the start, but also what we're likely to put back in place at the end of the project. And at this point, we can start to predict the gains that we might be getting and to really understand the areas of compensation that might be needed. And just to be clear, these areas of compensation, although this biodiversity net gain approach might sound very new and very different, it lines up beautifully with what we already might be doing. So the survey work that we're doing in the impact assessment, the biodiversity net gain piece aligns beautifully with that, so that we don't need to go out on site again. We don't need to do additional site surveys. What we need to do is add a condition assessment, add a piece of assessment to the ecological surveys that will be done anyway. For the post-development, the areas that you're identifying as compensation line up very well and overlap and join up with the landscape plan. They're one and the same as the landscape plan that we'd be developing for a scheme anyway. And you can use all of that area that you're identifying for your protected species, those species we had pictures of earlier. You can use all of that as well as part of your compensation and mitigation here. I should say at this point that protected sites, those SSSIs I mentioned earlier, the sites of special scientific interest, and any ancient woodland, any irreplaceable habitat, they're separate from this assessment because they've got existing policy requirements to deliver already, and so we put those to one side, but anything else can be included. Very often when we get to the design point, we go round again, simply because the design shifts for quite often reasons nothing to do with ecology necessarily, but because we've gone out to consultation, we've had a discussion and with the local authorities or the statutory agencies, and we've reshaped the design for whatever reason. And that means we have to reassess our biodiversity impacts and gains. When we get to construction, we actually need to run a very similar approach. We need to understand how the baseline has changed, if it has, and then start to understand the actual biodiversity that's being delivered on site as built. So at the point of design, we can report on biodiversity net gain in design, or potential biodiversity net gain. Through construction, and at the end of construction, we can report on that as built. One of the key pieces I want to pull out on the construction piece is about reducing time lags. Reducing the time that the habitat is lost for, especially if you're losing it and then replacing it, is really crucial and a way of decreasing risk, but also decreasing the cost, decreasing the amount you have to compensate with. Maintenance and monitoring is vital, and that needs to carry on through the development of those habitats that we're creating and enhancing, and that may be a longer time frame than we would look at normally through a development. In fact, the good practice principles, the guidance that's been produced by the organisations I've mentioned, suggests 25 to 30 years worth of funding for these habitats, with the aim of delivering long-term management. And that's because very often these habitats require that amount of time to meet their target condition, but also that's a good practice in terms of making sure that we're delivering habitats ideally for the lifetime that the built environment is there as well. And those ongoing management and monitoring requirements need to be, ongoing management needs to be monitored so that we can make sure that we are delivering the outcomes that we've set out at the outset. So before I get on to the next slide and throw us in another piece, this is the stages through our where we need to take on board Biodiversity Net Gain, where we need to start to try and assess it, and there is a standard metric for doing so, and that's what I'm going to show you in this slide here. So each of those steps through feasibility through to monitoring, we will run assessments. And one of the key things, and one of the things that's different within Biodiversity Net Gain from previous ecological assessments, is that that assessment is standardized and it's done using a numerical system, which allows us to understand the amount of impact and the amount of gain really clearly in a standard way. And this is the piece that DEFRA are developing at the moment. This will be published shortly, and this is a view of the new metric. So there was a metric published in 2012 by DEFRA. This is a view of what we think the new metric will look like. Although, as I say, it's not quite published yet. But broadly speaking, it's quite straightforward. For the pre-development habitats, for the habitats that you have at the start of the development, that's point 1 up in the top left-hand corner, we have the size or length of the habitat. Its distinctiveness, that's basically the habitat type, its condition, and then 2 area measures, how connected the habitat is to other habitats, and whether it's in a strategically important place for biodiversity. They're all given numerical values. We're not going to go into those today. There's a whole load of other training on running these assessments for ecologists, but they're given numerical values in a standard way, multiplied together, and you get a biodiversity unit score, an abstract score that is an indicator for the biodiversity on the site at the start. We then move to point 2, the top right, and you do exactly the same for the post-development, except for any habitats that you're creating or enhancing, you also add in risk factors. So we've got the same characteristics of the habitat, the size, its distinctiveness, condition, strategic location, connectivity. But we've also got risk factors, how difficult the habitat is to create, how long it takes to create, and the distance from site. And each of those risk factors represent different aspects of certainty that we can create those habitats. Difficulty to create, for example, if you plant 3 trees and 2 die, you know you need to plant 3 for every 1 that you want to live to maturity. Time to target condition, that's the amount of time that the habitat won't be there for until it's met its final aim. And distance from site, we wouldn't want to compensate with habitats that we're losing in Cumbria in Cornwall. It's no good for the local people that wanted to go and visit that wildlife site. It's also no good for the species who would have to move house. This, again, they're given numerical values and we times those all together to get the biodiversity units at the end. What's crucial about those risk factors is that they're all 1 or less than 1, which means that the area or the quality or the type of the habitat needs to be greater in the post-development in order to compensate for any losses from the pre-development habitats. So I'll just say that again just to make sure that that was clear. Those risk factors mean that we have to compensate for the losses with either larger areas of habitat or better quality habitat, better types of habitat for biodiversity. This reinforces that mitigation hierarchy, the avoidance, minimization, and compensation, but it also gives us a really clear standard way of assessing these areas of compensation. And basically, you then take step 3, you compare the pre-development with the post-development, and you can identify whether you've got a loss, a net gain, or neither. You've got the same amount, no net loss. And the government's consultation said they were looking for a 10% gain in these units, and we'll have to see what they mandate. BREEAM at the moment has a 5% as standard, and we'll see how that moves forward. But 5 to 10% is what's generally accepted. So in each of these stages, you might run part of that assessment. In feasibility and scoping, as well as those other pieces I talked about earlier, we also run that baseline assessment. That can be updated in impact assessment. stages, and you can see from that calculation that you could work out roughly the area of compensation that you might need at these stages, so that you can inform your optioneering, your master planning. Once you get to design, you can actually embed that in detail, and at construction you would want to then update that assessment based on how the design is built. And lastly, monitoring and maintenance, we can update that assessment further so that we can show that we've actually delivered the gains on the ground. So that's the biodiversity net gain approach. That's a very quick overview of the steps that we would run through, and a very brief overview of the calculation methodology. There are some complications behind that. I've simplified it somewhat, but I hope it gives you a feel for what we're doing. What's really important here is that this is aiming to deliver biodiversity gains on and ideally around the site of the development, to enhance that development, to enhance it for biodiversity, but also enhance it for people. So biodiversity net gain does mean doing more, and there is a cost to that. There's a cost to running the assessments. It's not massive. It's significantly less than running the ecological part of an impact assessment, especially when it's done alongside that ecological assessments. And there's also potentially a cost for delivering net gain, especially if you're impacting on high quality habitats. And the third point I wanted to flag is that that 25 to 30 year time frame means that biodiversity needs to be delivered beyond the time frame of the development. This is challenging, but also really important. And what we've learned from this is that getting in early is essential. So getting in and starting these discussions about biodiversity net gain, at the feasibility stage, at the start of the development, means that we can minimize those costs, we can minimize the risks, and that we can identify the likely areas of compensation right at the outset. This has to then feed into informing the design. Ecologists, landscape architects working really closely with the designers of that built infrastructure or built residential development or whatever it happens to be. Getting in at that design stage means that so we've done a lot of trial assessments on housing development, for example, and certainly probably more than half of the time, I'm trying to think of the numbers now, about 3/4 of the time, we're able to deliver net gain on site if the design takes this into account from the outset. This third point, integrated design, is really repeating what I've been talking about around those natural capital elements. And we will see this play out over the next probably few years. We're not quite ready to start thinking about environmental net gain just yet. We don't have the methodologies and the understanding quite developed. But it is the direction of travel. We will start moving towards thinking about natural capital or ecosystem service gains and then environmental net gain. But at this point, delivering biodiversity net gain should be done in an integrated way with those flood risk requirements, with the requirements on recreational space, thinking about how these join together and how we can get the gains for air quality, for other aspects that we might need to do anyway as part of our development. And we can use these areas of biodiversity to provide some of those benefits. We need to engage early. We want to know what stakeholders want. Those stakeholders, that might just be the local authority. It might be the local authority in Natural England or SNH, whoever the local statutory agency. It might be other organisations. On a big scheme, we might want to talk to local community groups or engage via the environmental impact assessment consultations. This is really valuable because this is actually a good news story, but also understanding what those local stakeholders want mean that we're not trying to create a piece of biodiversity in Cornwall from sitting in a room in Cumbria. We need to understand what's wanted locally. And as I've said, using these, there are costs here, but we can use these costs to decrease risks. We can decrease the risk to the development from late objections. We can decrease the risk to ongoing management by making sure that we're putting the high quality biodiversity into the hands of those that really are able to look after it. And we can make sure that we're removing other risks to potential impacts. And there's been one or two schemes, not very many, but one or two schemes where we haven't had to run environmental impact assessment, which the environmental impact assessment was only being asked to look at the ecological aspects, but we haven't had to run that because the local authority has said that, local planning authority has said that if you're running the biodiversity net gain assessment, we don't need to see the full impact assessment. Now those are two slightly exceptional cases, but there are some real added value there to be gained if we get in early and pick up this approach. The last point is about this delivery beyond the timeframe of the development. We can pass on that management to a third party. We on a highways verge, that might well be onto the organisation managing that verge, and that's standard practice already. We may pass it on to a management organisation, and again, something that many housing developers already do. But there's also possibility to pass on responsibility for managing sites onto third parties like wildlife trusts, national trust, who knows, the RSPB and others. And they've, in fact, they're good examples already of Network Rail, Team Bridge Council and others using organizations like that to pick up and manage sites, and they really are experts in creating fantastic high quality habitats, so why not ask them to do that? Of course, local authorities also pick this up, and we've got wonderful examples from Warwickshire and Plymouth City Council and others where they've picked up the management of the sites and taken that on, and then really making sure that we're getting those added benefits, the access to those places for the local communities, as well as the biodiversity gains. So that's all I wanted to say. We've talked about what biodiversity net gain is. I've given you an overview of the process. It's a lot of information first thing in the morning in 40 minutes, but I hope that gives you a feel for what it is, why it is, and the assessment. And I'm very happy to take questions or comments. So Jack, are you able to let me know if there are any questions or comments I might pick up?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tom. That was a really informative presentation there. So yeah, if you have any questions, just type them into the questions panel of the GoToWebinar. I'm just going to take this opportunity to let you know about our next webinar, which is on the 12th of June, and we'll cover project safety and risk management. A lot of registration is now open for that, and you will be receiving an email with the link to register for that one. Oh, Nick says thank you very much, very informative.
Well, that was an easy question to answer. Good.
Does anyone else have any questions? So Michael says he's interested in biodiversity net gain supplanting EIA. So do you have any comments on that, Tom?
Yeah, so EIA covers a whole range of aspects, and once we get to an understanding of environmental net gain, there'll be a much bigger join up or overlap between these things. There are some significant differences. EIA looks at, it does all the survey work, looks at everything on the ground, so I'm going to talk about the ecological aspect of it because that's the bit I know best. But we look at everything there, and then we identify aspects that are significant and where there might be significant impacts. And those might be significant at say a regional level. And we put to one side and say, well, the rest of the impacts aren't significant. The biodiversity net gain assessment takes into account all of the habitats, irrespective of whether in an EIA they would be considered significant or not. And perhaps I should have mentioned in my legislation that EIA has been in place for a while now, and still we're not seeing we're still seeing a loss in biodiversity. Perhaps maybe in the last couple of years, a slight slowing in the loss, but that's about it. So that EIA's work takes a slightly different approach. It's about impact, as the title says, and avoiding significant impacts. Whereas the biodiversity net gain is turns that on its head and says, all right, well, let's actually try and deliver gains here. Now, we will have to see, but the move towards environmental net gain does mean that there's likely to be an increasing drive towards gains across a whole range of benefits or impacts that we might be having. Whether it replaces EIA is yet to be seen. The overlap, as it increases, will mean that I think we're likely to see a shift in EIA, whatever, and my money's on EIA evolving to into something more in kind with a net gain approach. But I'm no expert on that, and I'm sure we could debate this long and hard, but actually what we need to do is start understanding what environmental net gain means in detail, and that's probably a couple of years away, or a year away at least. So not a full answer, I'm afraid. I think it's a really interesting idea, and I'd love to explore it further. So yeah, but I don't know quite what's on the cards there.
So Michael had a follow-up question there. I'm unsure whether you would have answered it already. It's not really my area of expertise, but would it be lawful to supplant EIA under the 2017 regs / the EIA directive?
Supplant? If you mean replace EIA with biodiversity net gain, only if the only impacts are on biodiversity, and there aren't any impacts on. There aren't other reasons for doing ecological impact assessment, then potentially. And that's down to the local planning authority to make a call in most cases. So the examples I mentioned where that's the case, it was a national park, I think, acting as the local planning authority that said that in one of these cases, it said that the EIA wasn't necessary. This example is actually in the case study document that accompanies the guidance that CIEM, Syria and IEMA produced. So you can have a look at more details on that in there. So whether it supplants it has to be looked at on a case-by-case basis at the moment. And as soon as there's impacts on other features, other aspects, whether air quality or whatever it happens to be, that would be normally covered by an EIA, then obviously biodiversity net gain doesn't do the job.
Okay. So we have a question from Graham now, and this is, how can you register or mitigate the impact of house building on greenfield sites, which are only average in terms of biodiversity? In other words, are not SSI, but form part of our green environment.
So if we have a look back at my scoring piece here, those greenfield sites that are not SSI, not important for habitats, let's say it's a piece of poor quality, grass and poor quality from a biodiversity point of view, that's the size of that, the distinctiveness and condition are still all taken into account. The distinctiveness, the quality of that habitat is very low, and its condition is likely to be very poor. And so you get a very low score, but you still get a score. That can then be replaced by something that's better quality, by a beautiful lowland meadow or something that's in between the two, a semi-improved grassland for those of you who know the terminology, or perhaps some other mixture of habitats. And so within the guidance and within the good practice, there's a whole range of rules about how you improve your habitats, that you improve the quality of these habitats through these steps. And that means that your housing development there, losing the green field, may well be able to deliver biodiversity net gain on site by enhancing the condition and the quality of those habitats that it's putting back. Now that needs to be done sensibly in a way that works for that development. So it's no good trying to create a fantastic lowland meadow if we know that that site's going to be a football field, because you can't play a football on a field that's nothing but flowers. So this needs to be done sensibly, but it's what we find is that very often that we can get across the site, we can find areas to enhance and improve so that that compensates for that larger green field loss. Does that answer your question? I hope it does.
Okay, let's see if he comes back. To Mark, who's just tried to book on the 12th of June webinar, you will be receiving a link in the email afterwards. We are still receiving a bit more information about the 12th of June webinar, so that's why the web page isn't quite fully populated yet, but it will be very soon. Steve Smith says, a very interesting CPD covering a complex series of issues facing us all. Thank you, Tom and Jack. Well, thank you very much, Steve. And then we have a question from Chris here, which is there a threshold size of development at which a biodiversity net gain becomes mandated?
We're yet to see that within the Environment Bill. We don't know. At the moment, local authorities are setting that themselves. Within BREEAM, there's no standard, there's no minimum size. So you can run this assessment as part of your BREEAM assessment for any size development. But as you get to a smaller scale development, or smaller scale impact, the amount of work you need to do, the assessment simplifies to a degree. The only other, and there are different examples across the country, but very often we're looking at major developments. So some local authorities are starting with thinking about major developments, and they define those differently across the country, of course. So yes, at the moment there's no standard. We're holding our breath a little bit to see what comes out of the Environment Bill, to see what that will be. But the other point on scale is that there is a significant section within the guidance on small scale developments, well worth reading. One of my colleagues wrote it, and from Footprint Ecology, and Rachel Hoskin, and I think it's really good. That sets out what can be done at a small scale. So the size of the development doesn't necessarily make it more difficult or less difficult to deliver net gain. It's the size of the impact that's important. And the quality of the habitat that you're impacting, which, again, if we get in really early, we can avoid those impacts and still deliver gain.
Okay.
So just to answer that question again, no, there isn't a standard threshold at the moment. That's a short answer. Yeah.
Okay. I think that just about does it for questions. If anyone wants to get one in really quickly, well, I'll just do my last little bit of talking. I'd say just thank you to Tom for delivering the webinar today.
Pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me.
That's all right. And this will be available on YouTube afterwards. Should be up by lunchtime. Oh, and Michael says thank you very much for answering his questions earlier. Yeah, next webinar is on the 12th of June, covering project safety and risk management. And yeah, I think that's about it. Thanks very much, everyone, and have a nice day.
Thank you, everybody.